Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult video number 285, the 4 modern occult golden ages. Now, by modern I mean like reasonably close to the present as opposed to antiquity, so like not 2,000 years ago or the medieval period or something. Really, I see 4 of them. You can argue that there are others, or you could argue that some of these kind of run together date-wise, but I think that there are 4 specific events and principles that really form the basis of 4 occult golden ages. Now, by the occult in this, this has to do with the field of study of reality, overlap with philosophy, a study of magic, folklore, especially looking back at the past and digging up mystic or materials or spiritual materials from the past that were either not in vogue or they weren't part of the general lexicon of the civilized world. I would say that it starts with the Enlightenment, late 1700s. And if you've studied anything about the American side of the Enlightenment period, a lot of the founders of the United States actually were very mystically minded. Some people say that they were atheists. That's not true. Christians also try to claim them. Everyone wants to claim the founders, but really what they were is quasi-irreligious deists with a great understanding of comparative religion, and they saw it in a somewhat secularized sense, and they studied it intently. They also openly debated the existence of extraterrestrials, and some of them swore they could see things flying across the moon. Whether they were asteroids or not, of course, we're not entirely sure, because they didn't have video cameras at the time, but they spoke openly about these things. And what had been a hyper-religious sentiment against even mentioning these things outside of an orthodox context of like the priest is talking about demon possession or something, instead of that, you get, for instance, the Book of Knowledge is from that period. I believe 1774 or thereabouts is when it was written. A lot of the basis of what became 19th century like fortune-telling, dream interpretation, horoscopes and stuff, it starts there. Now, of course, it had been spoken of and written about before, but because the population had become more literate, more interested in literature, much more interested in comparative religion, there was a lot more of this material, and it really does begin there. Prior to that, essentially, you only have a few centuries before that you even had the printing press. That's the late 1400s. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, other than some hermetic material, there's not a whole lot going on, and there weren't enough literate people to really supply an enthused population with regards to occult or spiritual debate. The second period, technically speaking, begins in 1822 when the Thompsonian method of medicine begins, with the idea of herbal simples and so forth displacing, in some part, prior medical practices that delved into giving people like mercury and arsenic and so forth would literally disease the population. Medicine had been very primitive for quite some time. What happened is that they began to look at some of the native peoples that they encountered, comparing their health to the European diaspora. Now, of course, a lot of it had to do with nutrition and lifestyle. But they said, well, it's obvious why. It's because they use herbal simples. Lobelia was a big one, according to Thompsonian tradition. Lobelia was basically the first cure-all since the philosopher's stone. They would give people herbal remedies. Necessarily, because of the studies they were doing, this involved itself heavily with folklore and folk medicine at large. And so what you get is an attempt to sort of penetrate these cultures and speak to people and find out medical lore, but along with that, you're getting the history of medicine, and it's about some god and how he climbed a mountain in order to cure his ailing demon wife or something. Stuff like that begins to enter into public consciousness. Now, what I see actually is that this leads to the next period. So in that period, you've got the contact, but there's still a lot of the world at that point, which is hitherto largely unexplored. In the late 19th century, technically you can start it with the period of the Industrial Revolution. With advents in better communication, steamships and iron sides and all of these things, certainly with rail, steam engine, all of these things, you start to get even further inroads, and what happens is in the late 19th century, anthropology is born. And people go nuts. For the first time, you have a very literate population, in the middle class, I mean. Prior to this, the elite, the gentry were literate. Most other people, they could read a little bit, but they didn't really have anything beyond like a third grade education, mostly. And the poor were fundamentally illiterate 90% of the time. Literacy was a mark of upward mobility. By the end of the 19th century, attempts at educational reform by the rich, usually, as opposed to by the state, by groups that wanted to be philanthropic because it made a good name for themselves, made them more marriageable and shit, and they looked better about things. They're still robbing people blind, but they'd give some breadcrumbs to people. It's sort of the way that the welfare state operates today. The lower classes start to be rudimentarily educated. They have a rudimentary education. They can read a little bit. What you get here is a lot of travelers' literature, which condenses things like religious history, anthropological topics, and also the cultures of the unexplored or less explored parts of the world and their folklore, their folk tales, tales about their religion, phallicism, and the origin of religion. They start releasing easily digested guides, usually under 200 pages, and people would read them while they were in the coach traveling to work or something. And they read quite frequently. There was no TV at the time, so basically the two biggest entertainment sources, reading and going to oratory. That is listening to lectures and public debates. It was a huge thing. And the whole idea of like a stump preacher. Why'd people listen to them? There's nothing else to do. And they sat there, they did a little opium, and they would listen to a stump speech. And so you get, for the first time, the real burgeoning of occult literature, especially with regards to religious history, folklore, and theory. And then, of course, at the end of that period, really the dawn, I'd say the 1920s, the dawn of the 20th century, the occult sort of wanes. The old, like the Theosophical school, begins to schism and fracture, and a lot of occult orders die off, or they become less used. The gentlemen's societies go into decline a few decades later, largely, and interest in it is kind of on the back burner. Now, you could say, technically speaking, if you look at like the spooky low-budget cinema of the 60s through the 80s, that there was a reemergence of the occult, but I'm not sure it's an occult renaissance, because by and large it was understood to be fictional. It was an appreciation for the fictionalization of the occult, the spooky side of the occult. Black magic, witches, Sabbath, and demons, Satan, and all of these things. Technically, the new occult renaissance, which is still at its peak right now, is the present. It roughly begins in the 2000s, with some of the online endeavors to take literature from yesteryear that hitherto, unless you had a big library in your hometown, a really good library, it was a pretty scant occult section. There's some religious history, some folklore and stuff, but it was limited. Like maybe a half a shelf's worth. Like at the Rutland Free Library in my hometown, and it's an intermediate-sized library. It's hundreds of thousands of volumes, but you know, it's not the sort of thing you get in New York City. It's not the Library of Manhattan or something. Reasonably sized, but the number of works specifically treating on spiritual issues would be a couple of shelves, and the number that delved specifically into magic and the occult side of things, even in an anthropological context, a couple dozen works. That's basically what you get, and the process at that time, prior to the rise of some of the stuff we got on the internet, the archive.org collection and so forth, which is highly searchable. I actually didn't know how to use their search system until several years ago, which held me back a little bit early on. Basically, if you wanted that literature, you had to get it imported to that library from another library collection, and you had to wait for an excessive period. You don't need that anymore. You can go right on the internet and download a digital copy. And I'm trying to, actually this is part of my own work with literature, I'm trying to help out as well by making properly formatted paperbacks of these works. Not only, to make income or for my own interest to have a physical copy, I think is needed as well, because the problem with a digital-only collection is the power goes out and it's not there. The battery dies and you can't read it. With a physical book, it's a lot more long-lasting. The problem is, in some cases, there hasn't been a proper modern volume made. A lot of the works that I've released are labors of love at the end of the day. A lot of them, I know that there aren't going to be more than a few dozen copies sold of some work. If it takes me a week to produce it and only 5 copies sell, I haven't even broken even at that point. I figure that unless I sell at least about 50 copies of a work in the first year, it's sort of, I'm operating at a loss for that time usage. But I've created a few copies of those that'll probably be around a couple hundred years from now, and I think that that's valuable. I would like to see other people begin doing the same thing, because there's still a monumental number of works are only available either as an old edition, a digital-only edition, or a new edition that might be affordable, but it's improperly formatted. People have literally taken the digital edition, taken the initial PDF scan of the initial 100, 200-year-old document, put it into a file, and uploaded it on Amazon, and the problem is that it's not, the margins are all over the place, there's missing pages, there's missing words, all the misprints are still there. In fact, you basically just perpetuated a damaged document. And it takes very, very little effort to do this. I'm wondering why Amazon even allows some of these publishing firms to exist on the platform. Amazon's losing money just by fielding these things because they're not even proper. Of course you're going to get complaints. It doesn't make any sense. Unless you're trying to do that and market it as a primary source, unchanged from that initial edition. So this is the primary source of a 300-year-old document. That's fine. But a properly made new edition, it's certainly in better, more readable shape, and you're going to have more people potentially interested as well in purchasing it. So I would say the present is the biggest occult renaissance. There's more occultism now than possibly at any other time in human history. There's more literacy and awareness of religious history, of the anthropological studies inside of things. By the way, as an aside, I prefer works from the pre-modern period, especially the 19th century, on religious topics. Because you got to understand that these groups and tales that were being interacted with inevitably got westernized and changed over time. You have to go back to like the first contact of tribes in order to get their legitimate oral history in these reports. You have to go back as far as possible to get as little change as possible. It's like when I was doing Hearn's, I believe it was, Studies of Japan. He was doing his studies fairly early on in the industrial period. It had only been a few decades, essentially, since Japan had really opened up to the world. The oral traditions were still remembered by people from prior to the Meiji period. As a result of that, it's more accurate. The tales were still authentic. There were still people that took part in those practices. If you studied the same things today, you'd get an entirely different view of the subject, and it would not be necessarily authentic. It would be real in the sense of modern practice or modern belief, but it wouldn't be from that pre-industrial period. So these older works are invaluable, because what happened is that while they were studying all these groups, everything in the world was changing. There's hardly a place in the world now where there isn't some industry going on. At least like even the deep third world, the capital city, will have factories and railroads and shit. This has inevitably changed the nature of human spirituality. Not necessarily in all cases, by the way, for the better. That's about all. Peace out.